Welcome everyone to Tuesday, as we continue our camera strike, simply because once more today, I guess it's getting slightly better. We are at 31 degrees instead of 32, so yay me. Today we are looking at the last bit of things that happened this weekend. We have looked at how things have been going in the raid when the mythic bosses were testable for the DPS, and then we looked at the results for the healers. So another thing also happened this weekend, which was Mythic Plus being testable. So what we are doing, we are now also checking the results of the specs in Mythic Plus. Not just that, but also what are players thinking about right now in terms of what are they playing as well, which might be a good indication, a good hint of what perhaps some of the, for example, better players from Mythic Plus are thinking of playing in 10.2. Since we have quite a lot to go through, for today we are going to be focusing on the melee DPS. As you can see from this massive wall of tabs from Warcraft logs, we went looking for logs in the last 3 or so days in this weekend, from Sunday on October the 8th all the way down to on October the 6th, and looked at all of the keys that were completed with a good amount of melee DPS, including some of the higher keys at first, like 26 keys being completed or 25 keys being completed from players you might already know of. For example, Yoda is here, you have Equinox in here, you have several players doing quite high keys, which might also be an indication, right? These players are tryhards, these players are pushing high keys on the PTR. You have known very high key pushers like Rare's Mythic Plus team doing a bunch of keys in Mythic Plus in the PTR, so it might be an indication of, for example, what are these very good players thinking of playing in the next patch. So starting from the melee DPS, we have to immediately disqualify a few of the specs that really have not been seen in the PTR being tested. This includes Fury, Arms, Unholy, Frost, and Windwalker. These 5 specs have been the least played. There were at best 1 log available for any of these specs in over 30 or 40 of all of the logs available in the last weekend of Mythic Plus testing, so there isn't really any data to go off on these specs in Mythic Plus when it comes to melee. Now, this does not mean for certain that these specs are trash and they are, F tier and nobody will want to play them in the next season, but for now at least they are not, they're not exciting many players to go and try them out on the PTR at the very least. So let's start with the clear and obvious. You will see from this log, followed by this log, perhaps even this log, maybe even this one, that we do have a pattern. The pattern is the very high presence of Havoc and Outlaw, and also the pattern is that Havoc and Outlaw are consistently doing the most damage across basically many other picks. Enhancement loses to them, you have Fire Mage losing to them, you have an Augmentation Evoker losing to them, a bunch of other specs consistently losing to them. Basically, the only way to have one of these specs lose is to have multiples of them in the same group. That's the first clear and obvious situation right now on the PTR when it comes to melee DPS and when it comes to Mythic Plus. Right now, these two are the more popular picks. It might be for a multitude of reasons. Maybe it's a tier set from 10.2 being super powerful for these specs, or maybe are the changes, the balance tuning changes planned for these specs. Obviously, we have a situation where both Havoc and Outlaw have been reworked in the PTR. We have put forward this fear a few weeks ago when we talked about, it looks like every single one of Blizzard's rework so far became an S-tier OP spec at one point or another. It happened to Shadow Priest, it happened to Prot Paladin, to Ret Paladin, to Holy Paladin, the newly added Augmentation Evoker. Even if you want to count Preservation and Devastation Evokers added before that became at one point S-tier specs, and it looks like right now the same thing is happening to these 2 other specs being reworked. However, many times when there is a winner, there must also be a loser, and in the case of Rogue, of course, being that you have 3 different specs, namely Subtlety Rogue as well as Assassination Rogue, are not really played nearly as much. Of course, when they are played, they also get blasted by Outlaw in terms of damage. This is definitely a better case than these first 5 specs, because even though, sure, they are being played less, it might just be because of how powerful currently Outlaw is. There might not be anything wrong with Subtlety itself, for example, and more so just how popular Outlaw Rogue is at the moment. We have gone through specific videos, both themed around Demon Hunter, Havoc, and what was changed around their build and the push to make Throglaive a central part of your build, as well as the combo of Immolation Aura and Ragefire, now doing way more damage, the moving of the Hunt to the general tree of Havoc, and how Fel Barrage was changed into a cooldown. And we also had the video about Outlaw and the very powerful tools of Outlaw, like for example nowadays being able to be in a Mythic Plus key that is 25 minutes, being able to have things like Adrenaline Rush active for almost half the time, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of your dice buffs being active for over a third of the duration of the entire Mythic Plus key. All of these things are being very good to Outlaw at the moment. So we are already versed in why and how these 2 specs are currently being so powerful, and as a result so played in the PTR. We do have though a few other melee specs to go over being tested right now. One is Ret Paladin. Ret Paladin right now in the PTR has been, decently enough played, the rare look of a Ret Paladin out-damaging an outlaw rogue and then getting it back, of course, but they have gotten a good amount of representation on the PTR right now. In their case though, unlike the case for Outlaw and Havoc being reworked, the case for Ret Paladin is actually their new tier set, because their new tier set, despite being nerfed already because of how powerful it was, is at the moment very, very good. Particularly the fact that both of them can function as an extra AoE damage. Using Wrathful Sanction buff you get from the 2-piece, splashing AoE damage to up to 4 enemies, and then the 4-piece allowing you to duplicate Divine Storm at 50% effectiveness, both work very well, of course, in AoE, while still having a decent amount of effect in single target, since you can also duplicate Templar's Verdict. At the moment, this seems to have, enticed enough Ret Paladins to try it out on the PTR and being quite represented right now on the PTR, as well as having a pretty good, a pretty optimistic outlook for the next patch. The other spec being seen in the PTR quite a bit, perhaps as a surprise compared to their usual, popularity is Feral. We have gotten quite a few entries of Feral Druids. They are also doing decent damage. It's not, of course, the case like Outlaw where they are just flat ahead of multiple other specs. They are present and they are doing, competitive damage to the balanced specs. Yes, they are losing to Havoc, but besides that, they do have relevant numbers against the more evenly balanced specs. In the case of Feral, they did receive a mix of both, in the sense that they did get a pretty decent tier set. One of the major parts of this tier set, besides the damage you get, is that now your 20% damage increase is tied to Feral Frenzy. This means it's not a proc, it's not RNG, it's not just happening whenever and you have to adjust to the buff. This one is tied to an ability that you get to decide when to use, and on top of that, this ability now has a 30-second cooldown. So it's just giving you something that Feral needs a lot in Mythic Plus. What is the biggest complaint many players had over the years about Feral? The biggest complaint is the fact that they take forever to get their damage rolling. It's the fact that they have a lot of damage based on dots, based on damage over time, which of course in a Mythic Plus key might not get full value. Now, with Feral Frenzy giving you a pretty big damage buff and you being in control of when you use Feral Frenzy to get your damage buff, this makes your spikes of damage more consistent in things like Mythic Plus pools of trash packs, for example. So these have made them more efficient in Mythic Plus, something they have been weak at for a for a long time, so that's also a pretty positive entry for Feral right now on the PTR. They still have to beat, let's just say, the stereotypes, the fact that they are not very played and not many players look for a Feral Druid in their groups, for example, but at the moment, just to name one, they are being played more, or at the very least evenly, with Balanced Druid, which is historically a very popular spec. Of course, as soon as the patch hits, Balanced Druids will be outnumbering Feral Druids in numbers of 10 to 1, but at the very least now, on the PTR, Feral is doing quite well. The last two are Enhancement and Survival. So we can start saying already that the numbers for Survival are not that high or as high as the other specs we just talked about. You do have some pretty decent results of Survival. Once more, again, not a surprise, they are not beating specs like Havoc, for example, but besides that, Survival has received a very powerful tier set. No, they've not been particularly changed when it comes to the PTR in balance tuning. Survival has not been given many. As you can see here, Hunter has received basically just a bunch of fixes, not really significant changes. The main change for Survival is their tier set, which is very, very good. What is also good, similar to Feral, but not as powerful, Fury of the Eagle now increases you and your pet's crit chance and crit damage. So it's also adding even more burst damage tied to a cooldown, not tied to RNG, not tied to randomness or procs, but just to something you click yourself. What is even more powerful, of course, is then the 4-piece. It's going to give you way more power into your Wildfire Bomb. Extra Wildfire Bomb casts from Fury of the Eagle, as well as generating an extra charge Wildfire Bomb, as well as increasing the damage of Wildfire Bomb to your primary target. So if we go back to your run-of-the-mill Survival players, you can see back on Survival a very high damage spread of your bombs. Basically a third of your damage as a Survival Hunter right now is going to be split on your 3 bombs. Yes, it's not quite like the power levels of Shadowlands Season 3 Survival Hunter when it comes to Wildfire Bomb, but it's definitely a pretty good position, a pretty good situation for Survival, especially in Mythic Plus, especially in AoE damage. Similar to Feral, Survival also has to beat the community perception boss in the next season. They are, to be fair, in a better situation than Feral. Survival has gotten to be very meta by the end of Shadowlands, so at the very least, in the memory of some players, they still remember Survival being good at some point, as opposed to Feral, which hasn't really gotten to that point in a long time. The last one left of the melee is Enhancement. This is continuing what we have checked at this point almost a couple of weeks ago when we looked at the popularity of the specs in Mythic Plus. Back then we were looking at multiple weekends, multiple instances of Mythic Plus logs. Now we're only looking at, the last 3 days, but the result for Enhancement is about the same. They are remaining in the low end of specs in terms of popularity now. And on top of that, their damage at the moment is quite swingy. Let's just put it that way. They are going on a similar level of change as Elemental. As you can see here, for example, you see Chain Lightning in a Mythic Plus key being used less often than Lightning Bolt, which is not what you're currently doing in live as an Enhancement Shaman. This is due to the changes given to Enhancement Shaman. Enhancement Shaman has received, on top of, quite a good amount of changes from the PTR tuning. I don't believe it was in the latest one for Enhancement. It was lower back down. You had a good amount of shuffling around of talents for Enhancement, as well as a few other changes to their abilities, which were all positive. And the result now is, for example, you have things like Primordial Wave having a much shorter cooldown than in live. In live, it's still 45 seconds. Here you see a Primordial Wave being cast at 222 and then at 247. That's a 25-second cooldown instead of a 45-second cooldown, and this continues for pretty much the entire Mythic Plus key. That is one of the more important changes for Enhancement. They might, to be fair, suffering from the fact that Elemental also has received quite a lot of changes and is also, as we will see I guess, tomorrow for the ranged DPS video, is also doing quite well in Mythic Plus. So maybe, although it's rare for melee players to go and try out and play ranged DPS players, maybe you have more shamans willing to test out Elemental in the PTR over Enhancement. That might be why at the moment Enhancement is not played as much, even though it looks like it's doing well. It still is a pretty enjoyable spec at the moment, at the very least in terms of popularity of the specs in Mythic Plus. It's not that high. This is what we have for now in the last round of Mythic Plus testing, which, unlike the rounds of Mythic Raid testing, which have stopped this weekend and there are no more scheduled tests, at the very least for now, Mythic Plus will continue to be testable every weekend, so we will get to continue to check and to see the situation for each of these specs evolve every week as we get closer to the release of the patch. But for now, this is our recap of the situation in terms of the popularity and the performance of the specs in Mythic Plus as far as melee DPS are concerned. We are now in this inexplicable heat wave in the middle of October, going to be leaving each other once more. We are starting our goodbyes by thanking all of the Patreon supporters for the contribution and the help to the growth of the channel, growth which, as usual, can still be given completely for free. You can like and comment down below, as well as subscribe to the channel itself. With these needlessly superfluous things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, well, there is one good thing of this random heatwave. Now I get to sweat even more when I work out. It always feels like you put in more effort when you work out and you're sweating a lot. So being hot outside is gonna make it feel even better.